wealthy woman mocks her reserved chauffeur, oblivious to the truth concealed beneath his composed demeanor. But as their journey unfolds, she'll discover the man behind the wheel isn't who she imagines, and by the end, her perception of the world and herself will never be the same. Witness how one woman's arrogance backfires in a way she never anticipated, proving that appearances can be deceiving. Don't miss this powerful story of humility and self-reflection. Like, share, and subscribe for more transformative tales. The soft purr of a sleek black car filled the crisp morning air as it rolled smoothly to a stop in front of the grand entrance of the Belmont Regency Hotel. Jacob Davis adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy blazer, his movements deliberate and calm. His face remained impassive, his presence unassuming. To the valet standing nearby, Jacob was just another driver, invisible and unremarkable, and Jacob preferred it that way. Stepping out of the car, he stretched briefly, his polished but understated attire blending him seamlessly into the background. His neatly pressed slacks, impeccably shined leather shoes, and an inconspicuous black watch hinted at nothing extraordinary, despite its extravagant worth. Just as Jacob opened the back door to retrieve his phone, the click-clack of rapid footsteps echoed across the pavement. Claire Mitchell, a sharp-featured woman in her mid-30s, approached briskly. Her designer heels struck the ground like a metronome set to an impatient tempo. Finally, she muttered under her breath, her voice dripping with irritation. Her piercing green eyes swept over Jacob, assessing him as if he were a malfunctioning appliance. Without waiting for acknowledgement, she shoved an expensive leather handbag into his chest. "Put this in the trunk, and be careful. That bag costs more than what you probably earn in a year," she snapped. Jacob froze for a brief moment, then met her gaze with the same calm expression he had cultivated over years of being underestimated. Claire wasn't finished. With a flick of her manicured hand, she gestured for him to hurry. "Well, move it. I have an appointment at Lux Haven Spa, and I can't afford to be late." Jacob exhaled slowly, keeping his composure. "Of course, ma'am," he said softly. With deliberate care, he placed the handbag into the trunk, ensuring it was secure. The trunk closed with a quiet click, and Claire climbed into the back seat without so much as a glance in his direction. Settling against the plush leather, her perfectly coiffed auburn hair swayed slightly as she reached into her handbag and pulled out her phone. She immediately immersed herself in scrolling through notifications, her attention entirely absorbed. Jacob rounded the car and slid into the driver's seat, adjusting the rearview mirror with practiced ease. His face remained neutral as his eyes flicked toward her reflection. For a fleeting second, Claire caught his gaze. Her lips twisted into a thin, dismissive smile, the kind reserved for people you don't consider worth noticing. "You'll be taking me to Lux Haven Spa on Beaumont Street," she instructed curtly. "And step on it. I don't have all day to waste in traffic." Jacob gave a polite nod, started the engine, and guided the car into the slow flow of morning traffic. His grip on the steering wheel was steady, his gaze fixed firmly on the road ahead. From the back seat, Claire's muttering began almost immediately. "Why do they even bother hiring drivers who can't manage a proper schedule?" she grumbled, her tone filled with contempt. "This city's service standards are a joke. And don't even get me started on how unprofessional some of these drivers are." Jacob's expression remained unflinching. Years of navigating high-pressure meetings and corporate environments had taught him the value of silence. He let her words drift into the air, giving Claire all the space she needed to reveal her assumptions. Traffic thickened as they neared the city's central district, and Claire let out a dramatic sigh. "This is absurd. Can't you take a shortcut? Isn't that what you're paid for, to know the streets better than I do?" Nathan glanced at her briefly in the rearview mirror. "I'll do my best, ma'am," he replied, his voice even and measured. His calm response only seemed to irritate her further. She rolled her eyes and sank deeper into the seat. "Honestly, I don't know why some people even bother taking jobs they're clearly not suited for. It must be awful driving strangers around all day, hoping for tips that barely pay the bills." Her words cut like barbs, but Nathan gave no outward reaction. He was accustomed to this, people making assumptions about him based solely on his appearance and the simplicity of his role. The truth, however, sat quietly within him. unnoticed and undisturbed. The traffic light ahead turned red, and Nathan eased the car to a smooth stop. From the back seat, tapping her manicured nails against her phone, Claire Mitchell barely looked up as she tossed out another cutting remark. "You probably don't even like this job, do you?" she asked, her tone dripping with faux sympathy. "Stuck in traffic all day, catering to people you'll never have anything in common with. That must get old fast." In the driver's seat, Jacob Davis's hands remained steady on the wheel, his demeanor calm and measured. Years of experience had taught him how to mask his thoughts behind a neutral exterior. Though his gaze flickered momentarily, he didn't rise to the bait. "No, ma'am," he replied evenly. "I actually enjoy meeting people from all walks of life." Claire let out a dry, condescending laugh. "Well, you've got quite the optimistic outlook. I'll give you that. But optimism doesn't exactly pay the bills, does it?" Jacob didn't respond, letting her words dissipate into the hum of the engine. Silence stretched between them, heavy but unbroken, as the car moved steadily through the city's bustling financial district. Towering skyscrapers reflected the morning sun, their mirrored surfaces gleaming. They passed a sleek office building with a prominent logo, one that symbolized prestige and innovation. Jacob's eyes flicked toward it briefly, but his expression betrayed nothing. Noticing his glance, Claire smirked, misinterpreting his interest. "Don't get any ideas," she said, chuckling. "Places like that don't exactly hire chauffeurs, you know." Jacob allowed himself the faintest trace of a smile, one so brief that Claire didn't notice. Keeping his gaze on the road, he replied simply, "Life can take us in unexpected directions sometimes." She leaned back against the leather seat, her laughter dismissive. Oblivious to the truth, she had no idea that the man she mocked wasn't just her driver, but also the owner of the company whose building they had just passed. Outside, the city thrummed with life. Pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks, balancing coffee cups and briefcases. Vendors set up their carts on street corners, while well-dressed professionals made hurried phone calls as they strode toward meetings. Inside the car, however, the tension was palpable. "How much longer until we get there?" Claire asked abruptly, her irritation bubbling to the surface. She didn't look up from her phone as she asked. "About 20 minutes, ma'am, depending on traffic," Jacob replied, his voice steady. She groaned audibly, tossing her phone onto the seat beside her. 20 minutes? For what should have been a 10-minute ride? This city's infrastructure is a joke. No wonder anyone with real money prefers New York or Los Angeles. Her clipped tone carried the unmistakable air of someone accustomed to having complaints met with immediate solutions. Reaching for a water bottle from the cup holder, she froze mid-motion, her eyes scanning the car's interior more carefully for the first time. The pristine condition of the vehicle caught her off guard. From the spotless leather seats to the impeccably polished dashboard, everything appeared far too refined for what she expected of just a driver. Her brows knitted in suspicion. "So," she began again, her tone laced with false curiosity, "how long have you been doing this professionally?" Jacob allowed a faint smile to ghost across his lips. "On and off for quite some time," he replied nonchalantly. Her eyebrows arched. "Interesting. I suppose you meet a lot of characters in this line of work?" "More than you might imagine," Jacob said, his tone polite but reserved. She laughed lightly, though there was a sharp edge to it. "I bet some of them are nightmares, huh? The way they talk down to drivers, treating you like dirt. It must be awful." Jacob said nothing, his silence deliberate and unyielding. It wasn't the response Claire had expected, and the lack of acknowledgement began to chip away at her composure. She wasn't used to being ignored, especially by someone she deemed beneath her. "I mean," she continued, pressing further, "I've heard some real horror stories about how people treat their drivers. But then again, I suppose it comes with the territory, right? You probably don't expect people to, how should I put this, treat you like an equal." Jacob's fingers tapped the steering wheel once before relaxing again. Steering the car onto a quieter side street, he left behind the congested downtown traffic. The relative stillness outside lent a weight to his next words. "Why wouldn't they?" he asked casually, his tone devoid of sarcasm or hostility. The question caught Claire off guard. She blinked, momentarily disarmed. "Well," she stammered, letting out a nervous laugh, "let's be honest. People don't really." Mingle across lines the way they should. It's just how the world works. Nothing personal. Jacob tilted his head slightly as though considering her response. Nothing personal, he echoed, his voice calm, almost musing. Exactly, Claire said quickly, seizing on his words to reassert control over the conversation. You get it. It's just how things are. I mean, I respect hard work and all, but everyone has their place, don't they? Jacob's lips curved into a barely perceptible smile. You sound like someone who's very sure of her place, he remarked evenly. She preened slightly, mistaking his words for a compliment. Of course, I've worked hard to get where I am. My family didn't hand me everything, you know. Jacob glanced briefly at her reflection in the rearview mirror. His face remained unreadable, his tone even. Must be nice, he said simply, knowing exactly where you belong. The faint undercurrent in his words went unnoticed by Claire. Instead, she leaned back in the plush leather seat, content with herself. It is, she replied, letting out a satisfied sigh. It's reassuring. Some people spend their whole lives chasing things they'll never have. But me, I believe in staying realistic. Jacob didn't respond immediately, letting the conversation hang in the air like an unfinished thought. Silence stretched between them, deliberate and heavy, as the car glided through the bustling heart of the city. Outside, the streets teemed with energy. Glass-fronted offices sparkled in the sunlight, cafes buzzed with activity, and professionals darted between meetings, clutching laptops and coffee cups. Jacob's gaze occasionally flicked to the sidewalks, observing young entrepreneurs deep in conversation and creative minds sketching ideas on tablets. This was his world, though Claire didn't know it yet. She couldn't see the connection, not from where she sat. The car slowed as Jacob approached a red light, bringing them to a stop in front of a sleek, modern building. Its clean lines and towering glass facade bore the name Vertex Hub in polished silver letters. Inside, coders, designers, and startup founders bustled about, their energy visible even from the street. Claire's eyes drifted lazily out the window. You probably drive people like that all the time, don't you? She said, gesturing toward the building with a vague wave of her hand. All these tech geniuses who think they're going to change the world with some app. It's kind of funny, isn't it? Jacob glanced briefly at the Vertex Hub, his expression calm and measured. I suppose some of them might surprise you, he said. Claire chuckled, shaking her head dismissively. Oh, please. Half of them will crash and burn within a year. Trust me, I know these types. My brother tried to start a company once, and it was a complete disaster. You need real capital and connections to make it. Most people just don't have what it takes. A slight twitch of amusement flickered across Jacob's lips, but he quickly masked it. The light turned green, and he guided the car forward, weaving smoothly through the morning traffic. In the rearview mirror, Jacob caught a glimpse of Claire scrolling through her phone again, her attention focused on her notifications. She remained completely unaware of the irony in her words, sitting as she was in the car, owned and driven by one of the very tech geniuses she had dismissed. For a brief moment, Jacob entertained the idea of telling her the truth. He could casually mention that he wasn't just her driver, but also the founder of the company whose building they had just passed. He could even drop his name, one that had appeared on Forbes and countless industry lists. But the thought left as quickly as it came. There was something far more satisfying in letting people reveal who they truly were, free from the constraints of knowing the truth too soon. The car rounded a corner, and the sharp spire of a prestigious bank building came into view ahead. Claire let out a sigh of relief. Finally, civilization, she said, her voice tinged with exasperation. You'd think a city like this would have better infrastructure by now. Jacob kept his gaze on the road. We're almost there, he said quietly. Satisfied with his response, Claire leaned back, convinced the ride and the conversation was drawing to a close. But Jacob knew better. As they moved deeper into the city, Claire's impatience began to bubble over. She tapped her phone screen repeatedly, swiping through apps as if each delay and failed notification were personal slights. Can you speed up a bit? She snapped. I swear, every time I have somewhere important to be, I get stuck with the slowest driver in town. She shook her head, scoffing loudly. And this is supposed to be a premium service. Guess that doesn't mean much anymore. Jacob glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his expression calm, deliberate. It was the look of someone watching a storm from a safe distance. "I'm following the speed limit, ma'am," he replied evenly. Claire let out a dry laugh, her tone thick with sarcasm. "Oh, don't even get me started on that. I bet you just love following rules, don't you? Must be comforting, knowing there's always some little boundary keeping everything in place." Jacob said nothing, letting her words linger in the silence. He had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than any retort. Frustrated by his lack of response, Claire leaned forward, her nails drumming against the car door. "I just don't understand," she continued, her voice taking on the conspiratorial tone of someone who thinks they're being profound. "Why do people make life harder than it needs to be?" Claire asked, her tone taking on the conspiratorial quality of someone convinced they were imparting great wisdom. "You've got one job: get from point A to point B without wasting anyone's time. It's not rocket science." Jacob Davis's lips pressed into a subtle, unreadable line. He didn't take the bait, keeping his attention focused on the road ahead. But Claire wasn't finished. "You know," she continued, her voice laced with condescension, "my father always says some people just can't help but complicate their lives. They convince themselves they're special, like they deserve more than what life gave them. It's sad when you think about it." The car slid effortlessly through a yellow light, Jacob maintaining his steady pace. Outside, the streets blurred with the vibrant displays of upscale boutiques, art galleries, and luxury cafes. Catching his own reflection in the rearview mirror, Jacob noted the calm, steady demeanor he had long mastered. Claire, oblivious to his restraint, adopted a note of feigned sympathy. "It's not that I don't appreciate what you do," she said, leaning back against the plush leather seat. "I mean, someone has to drive the cars and clean the buildings, right? But people need to understand their place. There's nothing wrong with knowing where you fit in the world." She paused, waiting for Jacob to offer some kind of acknowledgement. A nod, a polite agreement, anything to affirm her worldview. When he remained silent, her frustration deepened. "Seriously," she pressed. "Don't you think so? I mean, look at you. You've got a steady job, a decent car to drive. You should feel lucky. There are worse ways to make a living, you know." Jacob finally spoke, his tone calm and measured. "You seem to know a lot about people like me." Claire smirked, mistaking his restraint for agreement. "I observe people. It's kind of a habit," she said, her voice tinged with pride. "Besides, it's not hard to figure people out. You can tell a lot just by looking at them." Jacob's fingers drummed lightly on the steering wheel, a brief, rhythmic motion that ended as quickly as it began. He said nothing, letting her fill the silence with her assumptions. Claire sighed dramatically, leaning back once more. "Honestly, I don't blame you. The world isn't built for upward mobility. People like us, we're just lucky to have been born on the right side of things." Her words, though delivered lightly, carried a sting, a casual cruelty Jacob was well acquainted with. He had heard variations of this same narrative countless times, dressed in tones ranging from indifferent to outright hostile. The car rolled to a smooth stop at a red light. Jacob glanced at the mirror, observing Claire as she scrolled through her phone, her expression flickering between boredom and irritation. "You know," she said suddenly, not looking up, "I had a driver last week who tried to pitch me some business idea. Poor guy. As if I'd ever be interested in some ridiculous little startup." Jacob's eyes narrowed slightly, though his expression remained neutral. "And what did you say?" he asked, his voice even. Claire gave a dismissive wave, her tone flippant. "What could I say? I told him the truth, that he should stick to what he knows. Not everyone's cut out to be a business genius." Jacob let her words settle, the irony hanging heavily in the air. "That's honest of you," he said, his tone betraying nothing. Claire smiled, clearly pleased with herself. "I'm a realist. People need to hear the truth, even if they don't want to." The light turned green, and Jacob guided the car back into motion, merging seamlessly into the flow of traffic. In the rearview mirror, he caught Claire tilting her head slightly, still unaware of the reality of the man she was speaking to, a man who could buy and sell everything she owned without breaking a sweat. "You know what your problem is?" Claire asked, her voice syrupy with condescension. "You're too polite. People like you never get ahead because you don't push hard enough." You let people walk all over you. Jacob allowed himself the faintest flicker of a smile, one so subtle it went unnoticed. And people like you, he said quietly, always assume that being loud is the same as being right. For a moment, Claire blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. A shadow of uncertainty crossed her face as she realized she might be losing control of the conversation. But just as quickly she recovered, brushing his words aside with a dismissive laugh. Well, she said breezily, I guess that's why you're driving, and I'm not. Jacob's grip on the steering wheel tightened for a split second, releasing just enough tension to steady himself before his hand relaxed again. His expression remained composed, his focus unwavering. Outside, the cityscape shifted. The buildings grew taller, the streets more crowded with the rush of mid-morning commuters. They were nearing Claire's destination, but Jacob knew the journey was far from over. The car glided through an upscale district where towering glass buildings lined the streets. Jacob Davis noticed the subtle signs of restlessness in Claire Mitchell through the rearview mirror, the rhythmic tapping of her heel against the car's floor mat, her arms crossed impatiently. Do you ever get bored of this? She asked abruptly, her voice cutting through the steady hum of the engine. Of what, ma'am? Jacob replied, keeping his eyes on the road. Driving people around, Claire said with a dismissive wave of her hand. Listening to their complaints, running errands for people who barely acknowledge you exist. Jacob's lips curved slightly, though not enough to be considered a smile. It's interesting work, he said after a thoughtful pause. You learn a lot about people. Claire let out a short, disbelieving laugh. You mean how rude they can be sometimes? Sometimes, Jacob admitted, but occasionally, people surprise you. Yeah, right? She scoffed, rolling her eyes as if the idea were absurd. Honestly, it must be exhausting, doing the same thing day in and day out, being invisible to everyone around you. Jacob's gaze flicked to the rearview mirror, catching her reflection. Do I seem invisible to you? He asked, his tone quiet but pointed enough to give her pause. Claire frowned, momentarily thrown off balance by the question. Not invisible exactly, she said slowly, choosing her words more carefully. But, people in service jobs, they're just part of the background. Jacob hummed thoughtfully, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. Interesting perspective, he replied, his voice neutral. Claire missed the weight behind his words, her mind already moving on. She adjusted the strap of her designer handbag, letting out a sigh of impatience. Well, none of this really matters anyway, she said breezily. People don't change. The world stays the same, no matter how hard anyone tries. Some of us are born to lead, and others... She gestured vaguely toward Jacob, as if that summed up everything. Jacob's grip on the wheel remained light, his posture relaxed. And you think that's just how things are? Of course, Claire replied, nodding as though she had made an undeniable point. It's just the way the world works. Some people have what it takes, and others don't. That's reality. Jacob didn't respond immediately. Instead, he made a smooth left turn, steering them into a busier part of the city. The glass towers grew taller here, and the sidewalks were filled with sharply dressed professionals rushing between meetings. As they passed a sleek building with the name Davis Ventures emblazoned across its top in understated silver letters, Jacob's gaze lingered on it briefly. His expression remained unreadable. Claire glanced at the building out of habit and let out a soft, dismissive laugh. Places like that always amuse me, she said. Everyone inside thinks they're the next Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk. Newsflash. Most of them will be lucky if they keep their startups afloat for 6 months. Jacob said nothing, though the faintest trace of amusement flickered across his face. Claire continued, her voice light but condescending. I met a tech guy at a party once. He spent the whole night trying to pitch me some ridiculous app idea, as if I'd waste my time investing in that nonsense. No business plan, no connections, it was pathetic. She gave a theatrical sigh, as if recalling the memory was exhausting. Some people just don't understand how the world works. You need more than a good idea. You need connections, influence, capital. Without those, you're just wasting everyone's time. Jacob adjusted the rearview mirror slightly, his expression remaining calm. Is that how your family did it? He asked, his tone casual. Claire smiled, mistaking his curiosity for admiration. Exactly. That's how it's done. It's not just about what you know, it's about who you know. That's what my father always says. Jacob's voice was even as he smoothly interjected. And where did your father get his start? Claire blinked, caught off guard by the question. Excuse me? Your father, Jacob repeated, his tone devoid of judgment or sarcasm. Did he start with capital, or did someone give him a chance along the way? Claire shifted uncomfortably, the easy confidence in her tone faltering. Well, I mean, everyone gets a little help now and then, she said, trying to sound dismissive. That's just how business works. It's not a big deal. Jacob's gaze stayed on the road, his expression as steady as ever. Interesting. They passed another building, this one even larger, its wide glass windows revealing a bustling office space inside. Employees in tailored suits and sleek dresses moved purposefully through the halls, many of them wearing ID badges stamped with the Davis Ventures logo. Claire Mitchell gazed absently out the car window, muttering to herself. All these tech companies sprouting up everywhere, she said, her tone dismissive. Half of them are probably burning through investor money faster than they're making a profit. Jacob Davis said nothing, his focus steady as he guided the car through another smooth turn. The sleek towers of the city began to thin, giving way to smaller boutique-lined streets and high-end restaurants. They were nearing Claire's spa destination, edging closer to the moment when her assumptions would begin to unravel. For now, Jacob let the silence settle between them, his hands steady on the wheel. Claire continued to talk, oblivious to the identity of the man driving her. The car coasted down a narrow street lined with upscale shops and bustling cafes, their windows glittering in the warm morning sunlight. Claire's gaze flicked outside, her expression disinterested. Meanwhile, Jacob's attention was fixed ahead. He recognized the area well. They had just passed an intersection near one of his company's community outreach hubs, though Claire had no way of knowing that. As the car slowed for a pedestrian crossing, Jacob noticed an elderly street vendor struggling to maneuver a cart loaded with handmade crafts. The vendor's frail hands fumbled with the wheels, his frustration evident as he tried to lift the cart over the curb. Without hesitation, Jacob pulled the car smoothly to the side of the road and put it in park. "What are you doing?" Claire demanded from the back seat, her tone sharp with disbelief. "We're going to be late." Jacob turned slightly, meeting her gaze through the rearview mirror. "Just a moment, ma'am," he said calmly. Before Claire could voice another complaint, Jacob opened the door and stepped out, leaving the engine running. He approached the street vendor with quiet efficiency, grasping the cart and lifting it over the curb with ease. The old man looked up, gratitude etched into his weathered face. "Thank you, young man," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not many folks stop to help these days." Jacob offered a small nod, brushing off the thanks with quiet humility. "Take care of yourself, sir," he replied before returning to the car. As Jacob slid back into the driver's seat, Claire let out an exaggerated sigh loud enough to ensure he heard it. Her arms crossed tightly over her chest, and she muttered under her breath, "You've got to be kidding me." Her frustration bubbled over as she added, "Helping some vendor with a pile of junk? Do you stop for every random person struggling on the street?" Jacob shifted the car back into drive, easing into traffic without responding immediately. His expression remained composed, though Claire's words lingered in his mind. After a beat, he replied softly, "Just doing what I can." Claire scoffed, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Right, like that's going to change anything." The car rolled through the quieter streets, but the atmosphere inside felt heavier now, as if something unspoken had settled between them. Jacob knew better than to engage directly with her cynicism. He had encountered similar attitudes too many times before. He also knew that acts of kindness weren't about grand gestures or immediate change. They were about planting seeds, small moments that, over time, could take root in unexpected ways. Claire shook her head, her irritation simmering just beneath the surface. "You know," she said, "I've always thought people waste way too much energy on stuff like that. You can't save the world by helping one guy with a cart." "Maybe not," Jacob replied, his tone light and unbothered. "But it doesn't hurt to try." Claire snorted softly, dismissing his words as naive idealism. "Well, good luck with that," she said with a smirk. "The world's a mess, and no amount of cart lifting is going to fix it." Jacob allowed the silence to return, letting the hum of the engine fill the space between them. Outside, the city buzzed with life. Shopkeepers arranged their displays, joggers weaved through the sidewalks, and commuters hurried to their offices. Claire gestured vaguely toward the vendor they had just left behind. "People like that," she said, "they'll never get ahead. No matter how much help they get, they're stuck. That's just how the world works." Jacob glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror, his gaze steady. "You seem pretty certain about that." "I am," Claire replied, nodding firmly. "It's reality. Some people are just stuck, and there's nothing they can do about it." Jacob considered her words carefully before responding. "And what makes you so sure you're not one of those people?" Claire blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the question. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp. "You said some people are stuck," Jacob asked, his voice calm and free of judgment. "What makes you so sure you aren't one of them?" Claire's lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. For the first time since the ride began, she seemed uncertain, as though the carefully constructed walls around her confidence had begun to crack. The moment didn't last long. She quickly leaned back in her seat with a dismissive wave. "Please," she said, her tone sharp, "I know exactly where I stand in the world." Jacob's gaze shifted back to the road, and a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "That's good to know," he said softly. The car glided effortlessly through the sunlit streets, the morning casting long shadows across the pavement. They were nearing the spa now, and Jacob felt a familiar sense of anticipation building. Claire still believed she had the upper hand, still thought she knew everything there was to know about him. But the truth waited just around the corner, hidden in plain sight. Jacob had no intention of rushing it. For now, he let her assumptions take their course. When the truth came, it would speak louder than anything he could say. The steady hum of the engine filled the silence as Jacob drove toward their destination, but his mind drifted elsewhere, toward memories that remained vivid, no matter how far he had come. He could still see it clearly. The cramped apartment on the east side of the city where his journey began. The peeling wallpaper, the faint hum of an ancient refrigerator, and the rhythmic sound of his mother clapping flour as she made biscuits. Her voice filled the space, humming gospel tunes under her breath. She worked 2 jobs, determined to keep food on the table and the lights on, while always encouraging Jacob to dream beyond the confines of their circumstances. "You've got a sharp mind, baby," she would say, smoothing down his unruly curls. "Don't let anyone tell you you're not meant for great things. God didn't put you here to stay small." But the world outside that tiny apartment wasn't kind. Jacob learned early that dreams didn't come easily when you were judged for the color of your skin and where you came from. Teachers dismissed him before he even opened his mouth. Employers skimmed over his resume without a second glance. His peers didn't actively exclude him, but they couldn't see him as their equal either. Jacob's first real break didn't come from privilege or connections, but from sheer grit. He had built his first company out of a rundown garage, armed only with a second-hand laptop and a handful of friends who believed in his vision. They spent countless nights coding, brainstorming, and planning, fueled by cheap coffee and a shared dream. The obstacles had been relentless. Investors turned him away, not because his ideas lacked potential, but because he didn't fit their expectations. At networking events, he was often mistaken for the help, just as Claire had done today. Jacob's jaw tightened slightly at the memory. Even after all his success, the sting of being reduced to an assumption never fully faded. It had only become easier to mask. There were nights when he thought about quitting, nights when every door felt locked and every opportunity seemed just out of reach. But quitting wasn't an option. His mother had instilled in him a resilience that wouldn't allow it. "Doors don't open for people like us," she had told him once, her voice carrying the weary wisdom of someone who had learned it the hard way. "You've got to build your own." And so he did. Davis Ventures started as a small software platform designed to streamline operations for local businesses. Over time, it grew steadily, transforming into one of the most influential tech firms in the industry. The irony, of course, was that even at the peak of his success, the world still saw him as the help whenever he chose not to flaunt his wealth. No flashy suits, no entourage, no need to remind people of who he was. He preferred it that way. There was power in being underestimated. The sound of Claire clearing her throat pulled Jacob back to the present. She shifted in her seat, her impatience palpable. "You okay up there, driver?" she asked, her voice tinged with irritation. "You seem awfully quiet." Jacob Davis gave a small, polite nod. "Just focused on the road, ma'am," he said evenly. Claire Mitchell let out a soft scoff, entirely oblivious to the journey unfolding in Jacob's mind. "You know," she said, her voice carrying the casual arrogance she wore like a second skin. "You could probably learn a lot if you paid attention to people like me, people who've actually made it." The corners of Jacob's mouth twitched, though he quickly suppressed the smile threatening to form. The irony of her words was almost too perfect. "Oh, I've been paying attention," he replied lightly. "More than you might think." The car coasted smoothly around a corner, the towering skyscrapers of downtown giving way to quieter, more exclusive streets. Jacob knew this city like the back of his hand, its neighborhoods built on generational wealth, districts fueled by the energy of new money, and the overlooked corners where stories like his began. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. They were close to Claire's destination now, but he had another plan in mind, something subtle yet deliberate. The truth would come soon enough, but Jacob had learned long ago that it was far more effective when it unfolded naturally, catching people off guard when they least expected it. The quiet hum of the engine filled the air as Jacob navigated through a polished section of the city. Luxury boutiques and high-end car dealerships lined the streets, their glittering storefronts casting bright reflections onto the pavement. In the back seat, Claire's irritation was palpable. Her eyes darted from her phone to the window and back again, her expression an ever-shifting mix of boredom and annoyance. The journey had done little to impress her. Jacob, however, kept his attention firmly on the road, though his mind was elsewhere. The Emerson Spa, Claire's intended destination, was only minutes away, but he decided on a slight detour. Without warning, Jacob made a left turn onto a quieter street. Claire sat up sharply, her brow furrowing. "Where are you going? That's not the right way." Jacob's voice remained steady, unbothered. "There's a quicker route through this area. It'll save a few minutes." Claire leaned forward, suspicion sharpening her tone. "Are you sure? Because it feels like you're taking the long way." Jacob didn't respond immediately. Instead, he drove through the well-manicured neighborhood with the same calm precision as always, his hands steady on the wheel. Ahead, an unfamiliar building came into view, tucked between two sleek office towers. Its minimalist sign read, Davis Innovation Center, the name understated but prominent. Jacob pulled the car to a smooth stop at the curb and shifted it into park. "What is this?" Claire demanded, peering out the window in confusion. "Why are we stopping here?" Jacob turned toward her slightly, his expression composed. "I just need to make a quick stop, ma'am. Won't take long." Claire's frown deepened as she eyed the building. It was modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that revealed a bustling lobby filled with people in sharp suits and startup founders pitching their ideas to attentive investors. "Why would you need to stop here?" Claire asked, her voice edged with irritation. "What could you possibly have to do in a place like this?" Jacob gave her a small, enigmatic smile. "I'll just be a moment." Before she could object further, he stepped out of the car, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. Claire huffed loudly, her frustration mounting. She watched through the tinted window as Jacob walked toward the entrance with an air of quiet confidence. Inside the sleek lobby, the staff greeted Jacob with immediate respect. A security guard gave him a small nod, and the receptionist offered a warm smile. "Good morning, Mr. Davis," she said smoothly. "Do you need anything before your next meeting?" Jacob shook his head politely. "Just making a quick stop." "Thank you." Back in the car, Claire drummed her fingers impatiently on the leather seat. Her irritation had now been joined by confusion. What could a chauffeur possibly need at a high-end tech hub? Minutes ticked by, and Claire's mind began to buzz with questions. She glanced at her phone, scrolling aimlessly through her emails, but the nagging curiosity refused to leave her alone. Leaning forward, she tried to peer through the building's glass doors, watching as Jacob exchanged a few brief words with the staff. Their conversation seemed professional, but the words were too quick for her to decipher. Probably delivering something, she muttered under her breath, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Or maybe he knows someone who works here. That's got to be it. The idea that there might be more to the situation didn't even cross her mind. In Claire's world, people like Jacob didn't belong in places like this, at least not unless they were part of the cleaning crew or maintenance staff. Shaking her head, she dismissed the thought entirely. After a few minutes, Jacob reappeared, walking back toward the car with the same calm, purposeful stride he always carried. He opened the driver's side door and slid into his seat, adjusting his cuffs with practiced ease. "All set," he said, his tone casual. "Shall we continue?" Claire's eyes narrowed, suspicion mingling with annoyance. "What was that about?" Jacob's tone remained even. "Just checking in." He turned the wheel and guided the car back onto the road. Claire let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "You know someone in there?" Jacob didn't answer right away, letting the silence hang just long enough to make her uncomfortable. "You could say that," he finally replied, a faint, almost imperceptible curve tugging at the corners of his mouth. Claire leaned forward slightly, her curiosity piqued despite herself. "What, like a friend or something?" Jacob's expression didn't change. "Something like that." Claire huffed, sitting back in her seat with an exaggerated sigh. "Well, whatever. Just get me to the spa before I'm even later." Jacob nodded, his composure intact, and shifted gears. The car slid seamlessly back into the flow of traffic. He knew the moment of truth was nearing, but he wasn't in a hurry. Letting her assumptions unravel on their own was far more satisfying. Truths discovered piece by piece always carried more weight than those revealed outright. The hum of the engine filled the cabin, though it did little to ease the tension. Claire crossed her arms tightly, staring out the window with a furrowed brow. Every passing second seemed to heighten her frustration, her patience wearing thinner with every turn Jacob took. "You know?" she said sharply, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I really don't appreciate all these little detours. This was supposed to be a simple ride, point A to point B, not some kind of sightseeing tour." Jacob's focus remained on the road. "We'll be there soon, ma'am." Claire rolled her eyes and shifted irritably in her seat. "Soon? You've been saying that since we left the hotel. If I'd known it was going to take this long, I would have driven myself." Jacob glanced briefly at her in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. "I apologize for the delay." Claire let out an exaggerated sigh, ensuring he heard it. "This is exactly why I hate dealing with these services. You can never count on people to just do their jobs properly." Jacob said nothing, letting her words drift through the air like smoke. He'd heard worse. Years of being underestimated had taught him how to stay steady, even when people tried to throw him off balance. "You know," Claire continued, leaning forward slightly, as if to share some profound secret, "I don't get why people settle for jobs like this. I mean, wouldn't you rather do something that actually makes a difference?" Jacob's hand stayed steady on the wheel. "What makes you think I don't?" Claire gave a short, dismissive laugh. "Come on," she said, her tone sharp. "You're driving people around all day. How much impact can that really have?" Jacob let the question linger in the air, his gaze fixed on the road. Finally, he said quietly, "Sometimes it's not about the job itself, it's about how you do it." Claire blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by the unexpected answer. She hadn't anticipated a response that thoughtful, and it left her feeling uneasy. "Well," she said after a pause, her voice tinged with skepticism, "I suppose that's one way to look at it. Not exactly practical, though, is it? At the end of the day, you've got to think bigger if you want to get ahead in life." The corners of Jacob's mouth twitched, just enough to suggest he was holding back a smile. "And what exactly does getting ahead mean to you?" Claire tilted her head, considering the question for a moment. "It means not wasting your time on things that don't matter. You have to focus on real opportunities, things that actually pay off." Jacob nodded slowly, as if mulling over her words. "Interesting." Feeling a renewed sense of control, Claire leaned back in her seat, satisfied with herself. "Exactly. It's like my father always says, some people are just meant to be in charge, and others, well, they're not." Jacob's gaze flicked to her reflection in the mirror, his expression calm but thoughtful. And which one do you think I am? Claire smirked, crossing her legs confidently. Oh, that's easy. You're not exactly giving off in-charge vibes, if you know what I mean. Jacob didn't respond immediately. He'd learned long ago that there was little point in arguing with someone so determined to see the world through their own narrow lens. Instead, he let her assumptions hang in the air, undisturbed. For Jacob, the truth wasn't something you shoved in someone's face. It was a quiet revelation, something they had to stumble upon themselves. And when Claire finally realized who she was really sitting across from, it would challenge everything she thought she knew. Jacob Davis let Claire Mitchell's words settle, knowing full well that the truth would reveal itself soon enough. As they passed another sleek office building, its name, Davis Dynamics, gleaming in silver letters across the front, Jacob glanced at it briefly. It was one of his many properties, but he chose not to mention it. There would be a time for such revelations. Later. Meanwhile, Claire, entirely oblivious, tapped on her phone, scrolling through her social media feed. Honestly, she muttered, people waste so much energy trying to climb ladders they'll never reach. At least you seem to know your place. That's refreshing, I guess. Jacob gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. I'm glad you think so. Claire looked up, a curious flicker in her eyes. You're not like most drivers, though. I'll give you that. You're calmer, less desperate. Most guys in your position are always trying to impress people, you know? Pitching ideas, asking for handouts. It gets old fast. Jacob's expression didn't waver. I suppose not everyone is looking for a handout. Claire shrugged, dismissing the thought. Maybe not, but let's be real. If you're not at the top, you're at the bottom. That's just how the world works. The car slowed as they approached a traffic light, and Jacob glanced at the dashboard clock. They were getting closer to the spa, but he knew Claire's real journey was far from over. For now, he let the conversation rest. The silence between them grew heavy, thick with unspoken truths. Claire still thought she had Jacob all figured out. She believed she understood the man sitting in front of her, neat and composed behind the wheel. But the truth lingered just out of her reach, waiting for the right moment to shatter her assumptions. The car turned smoothly down a side street, the quiet hum of the engine, the only sound breaking the silence. Jacob could feel the moment approaching, the point when Claire's comfortable narrative would begin to unravel. As they neared their destination, Jacob guided the car into a wide driveway lined with manicured trees. The building ahead was sleek and understated, its glass facade gleaming under the late morning sun. Large silver letters at the entrance read Davis Innovation Headquarters. Claire's brow furrowed as she glanced out the window, confusion clouding her face. Wait, why are we stopping here? Jacob shifted the car into park and turned slightly to face her. I have a meeting here. It won't take long. Claire's eyebrows drew together as suspicion flickered across her features. What are you talking about? Why would you have a meeting here? Instead of answering directly, Jacob offered her a small, polite smile. Feel free to wait in the car, ma'am. I'll only be a few minutes. Before she could respond, Jacob stepped out of the car, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. For a moment, Claire sat frozen in disbelief. What is this? She muttered to herself, her frustration giving way to confusion. She glanced around the impressive building, her gaze catching on the sleek lines of its architecture and the bustling energy visible through its floor-to-ceiling windows. Through the tinted glass, she watched as Jacob strolled toward the entrance. 2 suited security guards greeted him, not with the casual nods one might offer a guest or delivery driver, but with deference, the kind reserved for someone who belonged, someone in charge. Claire leaned forward in her seat, her eyes narrowing. What the hell? She whispered, her voice shaky. Through the wide glass doors, she saw Jacob exchanging words with a receptionist. The woman smiled warmly at him, addressing him by name. Good morning, Mr. Davis, the receptionist said, her tone respectful. Your office is ready. Let me know if you need anything before your meeting. Claire's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. Mr. Davis? The pieces began clicking together in her mind, though she resisted the conclusion forming. Shaking her head as if to clear it, she muttered, No way, that can't be right. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she opened a search engine. Frantically, she typed, Jacob Davis Dynamics. The first article that appeared made her stomach drop. The headline read, Jacob Davis, self-made billionaire and founder of Davis Dynamics, expands global operations. Her hands shook as she tapped the link, skimming the article in disbelief. The photo accompanying the piece was unmistakable. The man she had spent the morning belittling was one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the country. How? Claire whispered, her voice trailing off. She stared out the window, her mind racing to make sense of what she had just learned. How could this be the same man she had treated like a mere chauffeur? She replayed every dismissive comment, every condescending remark. The embarrassment twisted in her stomach like a knot. Meanwhile, Jacob moved deeper into the lobby, greeted by nods and handshakes from employees clearly familiar with him. Each interaction exuded respect and admiration, further unraveling the assumptions Claire had so confidently made. For the first time in years, Claire Mitchell found herself at a loss for words. Claire Mitchell sat frozen in her seat, her mind spinning as the realization struck her like a freight train. The man she'd spent the entire ride belittling wasn't just another driver. He was the founder and owner of Davis Dynamics, one of the most influential tech companies in the world. "Oh my God," she whispered, her heart pounding. How had she missed it? How could she have been so blind? Just then, Jacob Davis emerged from the building, walking toward the car with the same calm, measured steps that had defined his demeanor all morning. His expression remained composed, but a quiet, knowing glimmer in his eyes made Claire's stomach churn with embarrassment. Scrambling to compose herself, she sat up straight, smoothing her clothes in a futile attempt to project some semblance of poise. Jacob opened the driver's side door and slid behind the wheel. Claire cleared her throat awkwardly. About earlier, she began hesitantly. Jacob raised a hand, cutting her off gently but firmly. No need to explain. Her cheeks flushed with shame and her mind raced for something, anything that might salvage the situation. But no words came. What could she possibly say? Jacob started the engine and guided the car smoothly back onto the road. The silence between them was no longer the neutral quiet Jacob had wielded earlier, but something heavier, laden with unspoken truths and Claire's growing self-awareness. She fidgeted with the strap of her handbag, casting nervous glances at Jacob from the corner of her eye. His calm demeanor was unshaken, and yet that only made her feel smaller. She felt foolish, like a child caught in a glaring mistake. "I didn't know," Claire said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob shrugged nonchalantly. "You weren't supposed to." The simplicity of his reply stung more than she expected. His tone wasn't angry or resentful. It was calm, almost kind, but carried the weight of something deeper, a quiet dignity that made her discomfort all the more profound. Claire felt the realization settle over her like a heavy blanket. Everything she thought she knew about Jacob had been wrong. She had spent the entire ride talking down to a man who had built an empire from nothing, a man who had likely faced challenges she couldn't even begin to imagine. He had endured her condescension without arrogance or complaint. The irony of it all was overwhelming. She had thought herself superior, but Jacob had been the one in control all along. As the car moved smoothly through traffic, Claire squirmed in her seat, the weight of her realization twisting her stomach into knots. She glanced nervously at Jacob. His face remained calm, his eyes focused on the road. There was no anger, no smugness, just the quiet composure he had carried throughout the ride. Somehow that made it worse. "Look," Claire stammered, her voice shaky. "About what I said earlier, I didn't mean it the way it sounded." Jacob's expression didn't change. His hands remained steady on the wheel as he navigated through a stretch of quiet streets. "It's fine," he said simply, without looking at her. But Claire knew it wasn't fine, not really. She had crossed a line, and no amount of clumsy apologies would undo the things she'd said. "No, seriously," she pressed, leaning forward slightly. "I didn't know who you were. If I had known." Her words trailed off as she realized how hollow that sounded. Jacob gave the faintest smile, one so small it was barely perceptible. "And if I wasn't Jacob Davis?" he asked softly. "If I were just a driver, like you assumed, what then?" Claire opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. What could she say? The truth of his question hung between them, heavy and undeniable. That's not what I meant, she mumbled weakly, her face flushing with shame. I wasn't trying to. You don't have to explain, Jacob interrupted gently, his tone free of judgment. I've heard it all before. The quiet resignation in his voice stung more than harsh words ever could. It wasn't the reaction of someone offended, but the weary acceptance of a man accustomed to being underestimated. Claire slumped back in her seat, her confidence eroded. She had judged him, assumed she knew everything about him without bothering to see who he really was. Now, faced with the truth, she felt the full weight of her assumptions, and just how small they had been. I'm really sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I acted like an idiot. Jacob gave a small nod, his gaze still fixed on the road. Apology accepted, he said simply. There was no triumph in his tone, no satisfaction at seeing her squirm. He didn't need her apology because, Claire realized, he had never needed her approval in the first place. For a few moments they drove in silence, the tension shifting from uncomfortable to reflective. Claire's mind raced as she replayed the morning's events, each cutting comment and dismissive remark a reminder of how wrong she had been. She had started the ride thinking she knew everything, certain of her superiority. Now all of that had crumbled, leaving her with nothing but the stark truth. She had a lot to learn, not just about Jacob, but about herself. As the weight of her actions settled over her, Claire Mitchell found herself forced to confront the uncomfortable truths she had long ignored. She had spent so much of her life believing she knew the world, its rules, its boundaries, its people. But this morning had shattered that illusion. I guess I've got some things to work on, she admitted quietly, almost to herself. Jacob Davis responded with a soft hum of acknowledgement, a subtle gesture that told her he understood without needing to say a word. The car moved through the streets with quiet purpose, the steady hum of the engine soothing yet magnifying the awkwardness between them. Claire wasn't sure what she had expected from this ride, but it certainly wasn't this, a humbling reminder of how wrong she could be. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly lost. Not just for words, but for the carefully constructed image of herself she had clung to for so long. The man driving her, calm, composed, and quietly powerful, had taught her more with his silence than any lecture or argument could have. The car continued its smooth journey through the heart of the city, weaving between streets lined with high-end boutiques, chic cafes, and sleek restaurants. Claire sat quietly in the back seat, her earlier confidence shattered. The weight of her mistake lingered between them, thick and inescapable. Jacob remained focused on the road, his expression serene and unbothered. He didn't seem interested in rubbing the situation in, nor did he offer any absolution. His silence carried neither judgment nor anger, only quiet patience, and that made it even harder for Claire to sit still. After a few minutes of the uneasy quiet, Jacob glanced briefly in the rearview mirror. "Are you hungry, ma'am?" he asked, his voice polite and steady. Claire blinked, caught off guard by the question. "What?" Jacob nodded toward a sleek, modern restaurant coming up on their right. "We're passing one of my favorite places. Would you like to stop for lunch?" Her mind raced. Was this a test? A chance to redeem herself? She couldn't tell what Jacob was thinking. His tone and demeanor were as composed as ever, as if the events of the morning hadn't affected him at all. Sure. I guess," Claire replied slowly, still unsure how to respond. Jacob guided the car smoothly into the restaurant's private valet area and parked with practiced ease. The valet greeted him with immediate recognition, his smile warm and deferential. "Good to see you, Mr. Davis," the young man said, clearly familiar with Jacob. Claire swallowed hard. Even the valet knew who Jacob was. Jacob stepped out of the car, walked around to Claire's side, and opened her door with the same courteous demeanor he had maintained all day. "Shall we?" he asked, his tone inviting yet measured. Claire stepped out slowly, smoothing her clothes and trying to appear composed despite her rattled nerves. Hours ago, she had thought she had Jacob figured out. Now, standing next to him, she felt entirely out of her depth. The restaurant's entrance was sleek and understated, with a discreet sign reading Haven in elegant lettering. Jacob led the way inside, and Claire followed, feeling strangely out of place. This wasn't the kind of restaurant she usually frequented. It was the kind of place where multi-million-dollar deals were made over artfully plated dishes. The hostess greeted Jacob with a warm smile. "Your table is ready, Mr. Davis. Right this way." Claire blinked, trying to process the ease with which Jacob navigated the space. Everyone here seemed to know him, and they treated him with a kind of deference she had always assumed was reserved for people like her. They were led to a private table near the floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. Jacob pulled out a chair for Claire, his movements smooth and effortless. "Thank you," she mumbled, sitting down awkwardly. Jacob took the seat across from her, unfolding his napkin with the same quiet grace that seemed to define everything he did. There was no arrogance in his demeanor, only a calm assurance, the kind of confidence that didn't need to prove itself. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Claire fiddled nervously with the corner of her napkin, unsure how to start a conversation. "How do you talk to someone you've so badly misjudged?" Jacob offered her a small, knowing smile. "Relax," he said gently. "It's just lunch." Claire let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "Just lunch," she echoed softly. The waiter arrived, offering menus with a polite nod. Jacob ordered with ease, selecting several of the restaurant's signature dishes without hesitation. Still flustered, Claire followed his lead, choosing the first item on the menu that caught her eye. As the waiter left, Jacob leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her with the same calm expression he had worn all morning. There was no malice in his gaze, only quiet curiosity. "You seem surprised," he remarked, his tone light and conversational. Claire let out a nervous laugh, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "That's an understatement." Jacob tilted his head, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Why? Because I'm not who you thought I was." Her cheeks flushed. "Something like that," she admitted softly, embarrassment color in her voice. Jacob chuckled, but the sound was gentle, free of mockery. "It happens more often than you'd think." Claire glanced out the window, struggling to find the right words. I don't understand. Why didn't you say anything earlier?" Her voice trailed off as she cringed at the memory of her earlier behavior. Jacob shrugged lightly, his expression thoughtful. "Would it have made a difference?" Claire opened her mouth to respond, but stopped herself, the weight of his question settling over her. Would it have? If she had known who Jacob was from the start, would she really have treated him differently, or simply hidden her assumptions behind a facade of politeness? "I guess not," she admitted quietly. Her voice softened with regret. "But still, I acted like a complete jerk." Jacob offered her a small, knowing smile. It carried no trace of bitterness, only quiet understanding. "Everyone has bad days," he said simply. Claire looked down at her hands, nervously twisting her napkin. "That's a generous way to put it." The waiter returned with their drinks, placing them on the table with practiced ease. Jacob lifted his glass, his calm gaze meeting Claire's. "To new perspectives," he said, a quiet toast to the unspoken lesson between them. Claire hesitated, then smiled awkwardly as she raised her glass. "To new perspectives." As they sipped their drinks, the tension between them began to ease. The awkward silence gave way to something quieter and more reflective. Claire could feel the weight of her earlier assumptions slipping away, leaving room for something new. For the first time in a long while, she found herself truly listening, not just to Jacob's words, but to the lessons woven into his calm demeanor. She realized with growing humility that the world was far more complex than the narrow lens through which she had viewed it. This wasn't just a lunch, it was a turning point, a chance to see things differently. As the meal progressed, their conversation settled into an easy rhythm. Claire, for once, let her guard down, though a lingering sense of guilt still sat at the back of her mind. She listened more than she spoke, realizing how much of her life she had spent talking over people she hadn't taken the time to understand. Jacob stirred his drink, the soft clink of ice against glass momentarily filling the quiet space between them. As they spoke, his thoughts drifted to the past, the memories that had shaped him into the man sitting across from her now. The road to success had been anything but smooth. It was paved with setbacks, closed doors, and endless nights of frustration. Jacob could still recall the sting of those early rejections, when potential investors dismissed him without so much as hearing his pitch. There had been meetings where polite smiles masked thinly veiled doubt. There had been moments when every door seemed to slam shut, even when his ideas were sound and his product had promise. He remembered one meeting in particular, at a prestigious venture capital firm. They had promised to hear him out, but 10 minutes into his presentation, they cut him off with a curt, dismissive remark. "You seem bright, but we're not sure you're a good fit for this space." He had known exactly what they meant. They didn't see him as part of their world, and that was all it took for them to dismiss him. But giving up was never an option. Jacob's mother hadn't raised him to back down just because the world refused to make room for him. "If the doors won't open," she had told him, her voice full of quiet determination, "then build your own." And so he did. Jacob worked harder than anyone else in the room, often without recognition or reward. Late nights turned into early mornings, and setbacks became fuel for his drive. Piece by piece, Davis Solutions began to take shape. It started small, just a software platform designed to help small businesses streamline their operations. At first, only a handful of companies were willing to take a chance on him. But from those small contracts, his network grew. Jacob learned to navigate the business world in his own way. He built relationships based on trust, not pretense, and surrounded himself with people who believed in his vision. Together, they created a company culture that valued collaboration, where everyone, regardless of background, had a seat at the table. It wasn't just about building a successful business. It was about proving that success didn't have to fit the mold the world had created. As Claire listened, she could sense the weight of Jacob's story, even though he didn't say it outright. His quiet strength wasn't born from privilege or entitlement. It was earned through resilience and perseverance. "You've been through a lot," Claire said quietly, her voice tinged with respect. Jacob gave a small shrug. "Haven't we all?" Claire bit her lip, unsure of what to say, but feeling the need to acknowledge something deeper. "It's just, you make it sound so simple, but I can't imagine what it must have been like." Jacob smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both sadness and hope. "It wasn't easy," he admitted, "but it was worth it." He leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting toward the expansive skyline outside the restaurant's floor-to-ceiling windows. "It's not about where you start," he said after a moment of silence. "It's about where you decide to go." Claire nodded slowly, turning his words over in her mind. They were deceptively simple, but carried a truth she hadn't been willing to confront. "I think," she began hesitantly, "I've been going the wrong way for a while." Jacob's gaze returned to her, his expression kind but firm, free of judgment. "It's never too late to change direction," he said gently. The weight of his words settled between them, filling the silence with unspoken understanding. Claire felt something shift inside her, like a locked door she hadn't even noticed was finally creaking open. For so long, she had convinced herself that the rules of the world were set in stone, that success was a matter of connections, appearances, and knowing your place. But Jacob had shattered those beliefs, not with lectures or accusations, but with his quiet strength and unwavering confidence. She took a sip of her drink, the cool liquid washing down the lump in her throat. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to prove anything, didn't feel the weight of pretending to be someone she wasn't. In Jacob's presence, she felt free to simply exist. As they finished lunch, their conversation settled into a more natural rhythm. Lauren felt herself speaking more honestly than she ever had before. Yet, a lingering sense of guilt still hung over her, a reminder of the assumptions she had made and the ways she had belittled a man who had quietly built an empire. The waiter approached with the check, but before Claire could reach for her purse, Jacob slipped his card onto the tray with an ease that suggested it was second nature. "You don't have to," Claire began, her voice unsure. Jacob smiled politely, cutting her off. "Consider it my treat. Lunch isn't about who pays, it's about the conversation." Claire sat back, his words settling deep in her mind. Everything about Jacob's actions carried meaning. His unhurried movements, his thoughtful replies, his refusal to dwell on her earlier behavior. It all hinted at a deeper philosophy, one she was only beginning to grasp. As they stood to leave, Jacob held the door open for her. Claire stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, her thoughts swirling with the weight of the day's revelations. She glanced at Jacob, who appeared as composed as ever, his calm presence grounding her in ways she didn't fully understand. "I've been doing a lot of things wrong," Claire blurted out suddenly, surprising even herself. Jacob raised an eyebrow, his expression inviting her to continue. "I mean, I've spent so much time thinking I had it all figured out," she admitted, running a hand through her hair. "I thought that if you looked the part, acted the part, everything would just fall into place." Jacob nodded slightly, his gaze steady. "A lot of people think that way," he said simply. "It's what the world teaches us." Claire let out a soft, bitter laugh. "I thought I was helping people by telling them the truth about their place. But maybe," she hesitated, the words sticking in her throat, "maybe I was just trying to keep them in the boxes I'd already put them in." Jacob didn't rush to reassure her, didn't offer any platitudes. He simply nodded, allowing her to sit with her thoughts. "I guess I owe a lot of people apologies," Claire muttered, mostly to herself. Jacob shrugged lightly. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe you just start doing things differently from now on." His words hit her with quiet force. They weren't a condemnation, nor were they an easy absolution. They were a challenge, a reminder that change was a choice. Claire exhaled slowly, leaning back against the car for support. "You make it sound so easy." Jacob's expression softened, a faint smile touching his lips. "It's not," he said gently, "but it's worth it." His calm, steady tone carried more weight than any lecture or reprimand ever could. Claire nodded, her heart heavy but hopeful. As the valet brought the car around, she climbed into the back seat, her thoughts swirling with everything she had learned that day. Jacob started the engine, guiding the car back onto the road with the same quiet confidence that had defined every moment of their interaction. Claire Mitchell glanced at Jacob Davis as he gave her an encouraging smile. His question, "Ready to go?" felt heavier than it sounded. Was she ready? Ready for what? She wasn't entirely sure. What she did know was that the way she saw the world had shifted irreversibly, like a lens being adjusted to bring a blurred picture into focus. As they stepped out into the warm afternoon sunlight, the city buzzed faintly around them. Long shadows stretched across the pavement, a quiet reminder of the day's passing. The valet brought the car around with practiced ease, and Jacob, ever composed, opened the passenger door for Claire. For a moment, she hesitated. Something about the day's events made it feel odd to sit in the back seat. Finally, she slid into the passenger side, the shift in position reflecting the subtle change in her perspective. Jacob gave a small nod of approval before settling behind the wheel. The engine purred to life, and they eased into traffic. Claire stared out the window as the city unfolded around them, her thoughts turning over the lessons of the day. The conversation was different now. The tension that had filled the car earlier had evaporated, leaving behind a silence that felt less like discomfort and more like a shared understanding. Claire caught herself glancing at Jacob occasionally, surprised by how much had changed in such a short time. After a few minutes, Jacob spoke, his tone as calm and measured as ever. "You know," he began, "I've been working on a project, something I think might interest you." Claire turned to him, startled. "A project?" Jacob nodded, his focus still on the road. "At Reeves Innovations, we've started a program to invest in startups, especially those led by people from underrepresented communities. We work with entrepreneurs who might not have the usual connections or resources, but have the ideas and determination to succeed." Her eyes widened. "You think I could help with something like that?" He glanced at her briefly, a small, knowing smile playing at the corners of his lips. "I think you're in a unique position to learn from it," he said. "It might give you a new perspective, help you see the world from a different angle." Claire felt her heart quicken. His words weren't just about business. They were about growth, about an opportunity to challenge everything she had clung to for so long. "I don't know what to say," she murmured, her voice uncharacteristically soft. Jacob's smile deepened ever so slightly. "You don't have to say anything right now, just think about it." She nodded, the weight of his offer sinking in. It wasn't just generous, it was a lifeline, a chance to start over and leave behind the assumptions that had defined her for far too long. The car turned into the parking lot of the Reeves Innovation Hub. This time, there was no detour, no pretense. The purpose was clear. Jacob parked smoothly, switched off the engine, and turned to her with an inviting expression. "Come inside," he said. "Let me show you what we're working on." Claire hesitated but then nodded. Something in Jacob's calm, unshakable demeanor made her trust him, made her want to see what he saw. They stepped through the glass-fronted entrance into a space alive with quiet energy. The sleek, open design of the building buzzed with purpose. Employees moved between desks and breakout areas, exchanging ideas with fervent excitement. It wasn't like any office Claire had ever seen. Jacob greeted several employees warmly as they passed, and Claire noticed how they responded to him. Not just as their boss, but as someone they clearly respected and admired. She observed the diversity of the people around her: young developers in hoodies, entrepreneurs in tailored blazers, designers sketching on large sheets of paper spread across shared tables. Their energy was contagious, their passion unmistakable. Jacob led her to a co-working area where a few small groups of startup founders rehearsed their pitches. He gestured toward a young man presenting his tech concept to a small audience. Though his voice trembled slightly, his enthusiasm was undeniable. "These are the people we support," Jacob explained. "Innovators who might not have access to traditional venture capital, but who have the talent and drive to succeed." Claire watched a young woman nervously explain her app concept to a group of mentors. Her hands shook as she spoke, but her eyes shone with a determination Claire hadn't expected. "They're not just pitching ideas," Jacob continued. "They're fighting for a chance to prove themselves." The words hit Claire harder than she anticipated. For the first time, she began to grasp what Jacob had been trying to show her. Opportunity wasn't just about money or status. It was about recognizing potential, even when it didn't fit the traditional mold. Jacob turned to her, his voice quieter now, but no less impactful. "This is where change happens, not just in technology or business, but in how we see people, in how we redefine what success looks like." Claire swallowed, her chest tightening with emotion. She thought about all the assumptions she had made, not just about Jacob, but about the world and herself. As they left the co-working space and walked back toward the car, Claire felt the weight of her own transformation. She wasn't the same person who had stepped into Jacob's car that morning. Her voice was quiet as she spoke, her words tinged with a newfound resolve. "Thank you for showing me all this." Jacob smiled, his expression warm but unassuming. Sometimes all it takes is a shift in perspective. The car ride back was different. The air between them felt lighter, yet charged with possibility. Claire didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt ready to face it. Claire Mitchell sat quietly in the passenger seat, the events of the day pressing down on her with an unfamiliar weight. Everything she had seen and heard inside the Venture Catalyst Center was unsettling, not because of the people or their ideas, but because they had forced her to confront something she had long ignored: her own assumptions. "I've spent so much of my life judging people," Claire said softly as they walked through the parking lot. She didn't look at Jacob Davis as she spoke, the words tumbling out as if they were meant for herself more than him. "I thought I was being honest about who deserved what, but now I think I was just being cruel." Jacob gave her a small nod, his expression thoughtful and understanding. "The hardest truth," he said, "is realizing we've been wrong about something." Claire stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "How do you do it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How do you stay so calm, so kind, even when people treat you like I did?" Jacob's smile was warm, devoid of resentment. "Because it's not about them," he said simply. "It's about me, who I choose to be." Her throat tightened as she absorbed his words. Claire had spent years believing that kindness was weakness, that strength came from walls and sharp words. But Jacob's quiet resilience made her see something different. His strength came not from the approval of others, but from his own sense of purpose. When they reached the car, Jacob opened the door for her, just as he had done all day. Claire slid into the seat, her heart feeling both heavy and strangely light. This wasn't just a ride with a man of influence. It was a lesson in humility, in kindness, and in learning to see beyond the surface. As the car eased back into traffic, Claire found herself staring out at the shifting cityscape. Jacob's kindness wasn't showy or performative. It was ingrained in everything he did, from helping the street vendor that morning to supporting the budding entrepreneurs they had just seen. It was a strength she hadn't understood until now. The silence between them was peaceful, but Claire broke it after a few minutes. Taking a deep breath, she turned toward him. "If that offer is still open," she said hesitantly, "I'd like to help with your program. I think I need to." Jacob glanced at her briefly, his face lighting with a subtle but genuine smile. "We'd be glad to have you," he said simply. For the first time all day, Claire felt a sense of relief, as though she had stepped onto an unfamiliar path but knew it was the right one. This wasn't about repairing her image or salvaging her pride, it was about doing better. From her handbag she pulled out a sleek gold pen, one her father had gifted her when she joined his company. She held it out to Jacob, her hand trembling slightly. "Here," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. "Consider this my first investment, a promise to do things differently from now on." Jacob took the pen with a quiet nod, his eyes meeting hers. He understood the weight of her gesture. It was a step, a small but significant one, toward leaving behind her old self and becoming someone new. The car hummed along as the sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the city skyline. Claire glanced at the dashboard clock, realizing they were still heading toward the spa. She almost laughed at the thought. The spa now seemed trivial, just another piece of her old routine that didn't matter anymore. When Jacob finally pulled up to the curb, Claire hesitated before getting out. The moment felt heavier than she expected. She turned to him, searching for the right words, though nothing seemed quite enough. "Thank you," she said at last, her voice soft but sincere, "not just for the ride, for everything." Jacob gave her the same steady, unassuming smile he had worn all day. "It was my pleasure, Claire." For a moment she sat there, unwilling to leave. There was so much she wanted to say, so much she still didn't know how to express. But as Jacob's calm gaze reminded her, some lessons didn't need to be spoken aloud. They were meant to be lived. As Claire stepped out of the car, Jacob leaned slightly toward her. "The world won't always be kind," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "But you get to decide who you are in it." His words hung in the air as she stood on the sidewalk, watching the car disappear into the flow of traffic. For a long time, she stayed there, the sounds of the bustling city around her muted by the thoughts swirling in her head. She had started that morning convinced she understood how the world worked. She believed she knew who deserved what, who belonged where. But one conversation, one ride, had unraveled everything she thought she knew. Claire wasn't the same person who had climbed into that car hours ago. She wasn't sure who she was becoming, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was on the right path. The city moved on around her, but Claire felt strangely still. It wasn't just the end of a ride, it was the beginning of a new journey, and this time, she was ready to take it. If today's story resonated with you, remember, it's never too late to change how you see the world. Treat others with kindness, because you never know who might surprise you. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that inspire and transform.